Your alarm goes off. You wake up, you check your phone. Phew, you have 17 unread emails, 3 of which arrived at 2 a.m. from people who apparently do not sleep, 2 notifications from apps you forgot you downloaded, and 1 message from a family group chat that has been going since 2019 and shows no signs of stopping. It is 6:30 in the morning, you have been awake for 45 seconds, you are already behind. You haven't eaten, you haven't moved, you are technically still horizontal, and somehow there is already a list of things demanding your attention. You drag yourself to the kitchen, you make coffee, you open your laptop, because if you don't clear some of those emails before 9 a.m., the entire day gets worse. Your body is doing something interesting while this is happening. It is releasing cortisol, which is your stress hormone, which is designed to help you run from predators or hunt large animals, and which is instead being triggered by a notification sound. The same biochemical alarm system your prehistoric ancestors used to survive lion attacks is currently being activated by your inbox. That's fine. Everything is fine. Now let's talk about what a prehistoric human was doing at this exact time of morning, and more importantly, what they weren't doing. Because it turns out we've had about 10,000 years to get the daily schedule completely, systematically, and almost impressively wrong. Tell me in the comments, what time does your alarm go off? Because this is about to get very personal. First, let me give you the data. In 2015, a sleep researcher named Jerome Siegel, professor of psychiatry at UCLA's Semel Institute of Neuroscience and Human Behavior, published a study in the journal Current Biology that tracked the actual sleep patterns of 3 hunter-gatherer populations living without electricity, artificial lighting, or climate control. The Hadza of Tanzania, hunter-gatherers who live near the Serengeti National Park. The San of Namibia in the Kalahari Desert. The Tsimane of Bolivia, living along the Andean foothills, working with researchers from Hunter College. Yale University, UC Santa Barbara, and the University of New Mexico, Siegel strapped small wristwatch-sized devices called ActiWatch 2 units, similar to a Fitbit but precision-calibrated for sleep research, onto 94 adults across all 3 groups, collecting 1,165 total days of sleep and activity data. The devices measured sleeping and waking times, light exposure, and movement around the clock, 24 hours a day, for up to 28 days each. What he found challenged almost everything the wellness industry had been telling you. The average sleep duration across all 3 groups, 6 hours and 25 minutes in warmer months, 6.6 to 7.1 hours in cooler months. At the low end of what adults in industrialized Europe and America report, these people were not sleeping more than us. They were not sleeping 8 or 9 hours. The 8 hours of sleep is natural message you've been absorbing from every sleep content creator on social media since 2018 is not supported by the only study that has ever actually measured pre-industrial sleep in real living populations. Siegel himself stated it plainly. The argument has always been that modern life has reduced our sleep time below the amount our ancestors got. But our data indicates that this is a myth. But here's the part that matters even more for what we're building today. The prehistoric human was not falling asleep at sunset. The populations Siegel tracked stayed awake an average of 3 hours and 20 minutes after sunset. They went to sleep when the temperature dropped. They woke up when the day began warming from sunrise. Not from an alarm, not from a schedule, from temperature, from light, from the body's response to the actual environment. Siegel noted this directly. The fact that we all stay up hours after sunset is absolutely normal and does not appear to be a new development. Staying up after dark is not a modern corruption. It's what humans do. And waking up when the sun warms things up, rather than when a buzzing rectangle demands it, is the system the body was designed for. That system produces around 6.5 hours of sleep, and the populations living by it have lower obesity rates, lower blood pressure, and no reported epidemic of insomnia. So, let's actually run the clock. Let's walk through what prehistoric humans were doing, hour by hour, with real data, and build the schedule the title of this video promised you. The prehistoric human doesn't have a fixed wake time. This is the first thing that's going to irritate you if you run a calendar-based life. They wake when the environment says it's time, specifically, when the air temperature starts rising with the sun. In equatorial Africa, where most of our prehistoric ancestors lived for the majority of human history, this might be around 5:30 to 6:30 in the morning depending on season. In the Tsimane camps in Bolivia that Siegel's team measured, the pattern held even across latitude differences. Temperature drives the wake signal, not obligation. Not a meeting at 9, temperature. The body responds to thermal cues. In the absence of artificial heating and cooling, the morning cool gives way to warmth, and that warmth says, time. The cortisol that rises to get you out of bed in the morning is called the cortisol awakening response, and in people sleeping in natural thermal environments, it appears to sync more cleanly with this environmental signal. You wake up gently. You have not been ripped from REM sleep by a sound at 6:27 because that's when the meeting is. What happens next is also not what you expect. Based on observations of living hunter-gatherer groups, including the Hadza, studied extensively by Herman Pontzer of Yale and Duke University, alongside Brian Wood and David Rachlan from Yale, and the University of Arizona, the first activities of the day are not work. They're social. People emerge from sleeping areas gradually. There's fire maintenance, there's conversation, there's movement. But the movement isn't purposeful in the way we define purposeful. It's casual, preparatory. The social fabric of the group does its morning maintenance the way you might imagine people doing it, if nobody had anywhere to be at a specific time. Because nobody did, here's where the data that built the title starts. In 1966, at a symposium in Chicago called Man the Hunter, American cultural anthropologist Marshall Sahlins presented what became one of the most referenced and most debated findings in all of anthropology, based on two independent datasets. Richard B. Lee's fieldwork with the Kung San of Southern Africa, published through the 1960s, and the Arnhem Land study conducted by McCarthy and MacArthur in Australia, Sahlins made an argument that flatly contradicted 200 years of assumptions about prehistoric life. Hunter-gatherers, he said, were not chronically starving, endlessly laboring, perpetually desperate people scrabbling at the margins of survival. They were working 3 to 5 hours per day on food acquisition, 15 to 20 hours per week. They had what Sahlins called, in his deliberately provocative phrasing, the original affluent society. Not affluent in stuff, affluent in time. Affluent in the only resource that actually matters and that you cannot earn more of or buy more of or productivity hack your way into getting more of. Time. They had time in quantities that would make a modern professional actually cry if you put the comparison in front of them in a spreadsheet. Richard Lee tracked the Kung San in the Kalahari across specific observation periods and documented what he found with meticulous care. The Kung needed approximately 2.5 days of work to feed themselves for a week. The remainder, and this is not an exaggeration, was leisure time. Rest, social engagement, music, conversation. When Lee calculated the total time spent on food acquisition plus processing plus cooking, the figure for men was 44.5 hours per week, and for women 40.1 hours per week. Sahlins pointed out that even this total, which includes everything, the hunting, the gathering, the preparation, the cooking, is less than or comparable to what modern Western workers spend on combined work and domestic labor. And the food acquisition component alone, the part that's actually analogous to a workday, is 15 to 20 hours per week, 3 to 5 hours a day. And then, nothing. Nothing that we would recognize as obligatory. Nothing with a deadline. Nothing with a performance review attached. Sahlins' theory has been challenged, debated, refined, and partially revised in the decades since. Some critics argued his data was too selective, or that he underweighted the effort of preparing and processing food. These are fair critiques, but the core finding has been supported repeatedly. A 2019 study published in Nature Human Behaviour by Dr. Mark Dybel of the University of Cambridge, alongside Abigail Page of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and Daniel Smith of the University of Bristol, measured this in real time with 359 Agta hunter-gatherers in the northern Philippines, recording what every person in 10 communities was doing at regular intervals between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. across 2 full years of fieldwork. The Agta, who remained primarily foragers, worked approximately 20 hours per week. When those same communities adopted agriculture, when they added rice farming to their foraging, the weekly work hours jumped to around 33, 10 hours extra per week, every week, for less dietary variety, for harder physical labor, for tasks that were more repetitive and less cognitively engaging than foraging. And the burden fell heaviest on women, who saw the sharpest increase in out-of-camp work time when farming came in. Dybel's team concluded what the data showed. Hunting and gathering allows a significant amount of leisure time, and this is lost as communities adopt small-scale agriculture. So the prehistoric mid-morning looks like this. A group of Hadza men leave camp on foot. They will walk between 8 and 12 kilometers today. They carry bows, they look for tracks, they read the landscape, they communicate with each other constantly, not in meetings, not in emails, but in the immediate, embodied, present-moment language of people navigating shared terrain toward a shared goal, with no fixed end time. If they find game, the hunt can take additional hours. If they don't, they return earlier. The women foraging separately, with children often alongside, cover 5 to 7 kilometers while digging tubers, collecting berries, reading which plants are ready, processing what they find as they go. This is physically demanding. It requires real expertise. The cognitive load of navigating foraging grounds, knowing seasonal plant cycles, tracking animals through varied terrain. Researchers have noted this is anything but mindless activity. Pontzer's team documented that Hadza adults' cardiovascular activity throughout the day was higher than many American adults get in a full week. And then, around midday or early afternoon, it stops. Not because a lunch break was scheduled, because the work is done, there's food, the caloric requirement for the day has been met. There is no reason to continue in the way there is if you're working for wages against a quota or a deadline or a performance metric. This is the part of the prehistoric schedule that almost never makes it into the content about prehistoric life. Because it's not dramatic. There's no predator, there's no discovery. There is just time. And the way that time was spent is one of the most important things in this entire video. After the primary food work of the day, Hadza camps observed by Pontzer's team and by anthropologist Frank Marlowe of Cambridge showed patterns of rest, social grooming, conversation, craft work, music, and play. The fire. Always the fire. A central fire around which people gather, talk, tell stories, watch children, do the small maintenance tasks of communal life, tool maintenance, hide working. These are activities, but not in the way we mean when we say activities. There's no schedule, there's no productivity goal, there's no output metric. There's a group of people with enough food and enough shelter and enough time being together. Anthropologist Wiessner of the University of Utah spent years studying the Kungsan and documented specifically how fireside conversations at night differed from daytime interactions. Daytime talk in forager groups, economic, practical, immediate, who saw what needs to happen. Night talk, around the fire. Stories, metaphor, humor, discussion of distant places and absent people, speculation, myth, planning that runs across timescales longer than tomorrow. Wiessner published this research in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2014. Night talk, she concluded, was a critical mechanism for social bonding, cultural transmission, and the development of complex social networks that extended beyond the immediate group. The fireside was the internet. It was where information moved. It was where identity got negotiated. It was where children heard what the group believed about the world and their place in it. And it happened every single night. Every night, as a structured communal activity, not as a choice between this and a TV show, as the default, as the thing. Music, dance, documented in virtually every hunter-gatherer society ever studied. The Hadza sing. The Kungsan perform healing dances that last through entire nights. Indigenous Australian groups maintain oral traditions of extraordinary complexity, including the song lines. Navigational routes across thousands of kilometers of landscape, encoded into music and performance. Memorized across generations, the Tsimane have musical traditions studied by researchers from the Max Planck Institute and Harvard in a 2019 cross-cultural study on music perception published in Science. The musical complexity, the rhythmic sophistication, the communal function of music in forager societies is not a recreational afterthought. It is embedded. It is structural. Music is not what you do after the day is over. Music is part of the day. It always was. Now let's talk about the moment everything changed. Because this is the specific pivot point that explains why you are reading emails at 6:30 in the morning and why the prehistoric human at your equivalent age was doing something completely different. Around 10,000 years ago, in multiple independent locations, the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, the Yangtze and Yellow River valleys in China, the highlands of New Guinea, central Mexico, the Andes, humans began domesticating plants and animals. The Neolithic agricultural revolution, the thing usually presented in history class as one of the greatest leaps forward in human progress, the beginning of civilization, the foundation of cities, writing, government, science, art, everything good. And that framing is not wrong exactly. Agriculture did enable population growth, social complexity, specialization, and the accumulation of knowledge and resources that eventually produced the world we live in. None of that is false. But here's what the framing tends to leave out. The individual humans who made the transition from foraging to farming in those early millennia did not experience it as a step forward. They experienced it as more work, worse food, more disease, shorter lives, and less time, significantly less time. The physical anthropological record of the agricultural transition is remarkably consistent across multiple continents and multiple time periods. Researchers examining skeletal remains from pre-agricultural and post-agricultural populations at the same geographic locations find a consistent pattern. Farmers were shorter than foragers in the same regions, by 3 to 4 inches on average, reflecting worse childhood nutrition. Farmers had higher rates of tooth decay, as we documented in the paleo diet video from this channel. From the starchy monoculture diet that replaced the varied forager diet, farmers had higher rates of infectious disease. Because settled communities and dense livestock created new disease transmission vectors, farmers showed more skeletal markers of repetitive stress injury, the specific wear patterns that come from doing the same physical motion thousands of times over and over, rather than the varied movement of foraging, and farmers died younger on average than their forager counterparts in comparable environments. This is not speculation, this is hard physical data from bones, published in peer-reviewed journals across decades of paleoanthropological research. Jared Diamond, in one of the most cited essays in all of science journalism, published in Discover magazine in 1987, and later referenced extensively in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book Guns, Germs, and Steel, called the invention of agriculture the worst mistake in the history of the human race. That is an intentional provocation, not a literal conclusion, but the evidence behind the provocation is real. The Agta data from Deibel's 2019 study is particularly useful here because it's direct, same population, same genes, same environment, different work pattern based on how much farming each community has adopted. The result is clean. More farming equals more work hours, equals less leisure time, equals a worse distribution of that time specifically for women. Agriculture didn't free people from toil, it increased it. And then the Industrial Revolution arrived and made the increase catastrophic. Before the late 19th century labor movement began fighting for limits on working hours, factory workers in Britain, the United States, and across industrializing Europe were routinely working 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week. In some industries, even longer. Children worked in factories. 12-year-olds worked in mines. The work was physically destructive, the hours were endless, and the compensation was designed to keep workers returning out of necessity. The gap between the 3 to 5 hours of forager work time and the 18-hour industrial shift is not gradual drift. It is a specific, documented, historically traceable degradation of human working conditions that took place over a very short period of time. Robert Owen, a Welsh textile manufacturer, who had enough self-awareness to recognize what his industry was doing to people, coined the phrase in 1817, 8 hours labor, 8 hours recreation, 8 hours rest. He divided the 24-hour day into 3 equal segments. His campaign was considered radical, revolutionary. 8 hours was the aspirational target, the reform that labor movements across the Western world spent the better part of a century fighting for, sometimes violently. The Haymarket Affair in Chicago in 1886, where workers rallying for 8-hour days were caught in a bombing that killed police officers and civilians, was about the 8-hour day. People died in the streets of American cities for the right to work only 8 hours instead of 12 or 14. And in 1914, Ford Motor Company cut shifts from 9 hours to 8. In 1926, Henry Ford formally adopted the 40-hour 5-day workweek, not for altruistic reasons, but because his economic analysis showed that workers with more leisure time spent more money, including on cars, which Ford happened to make. Ford wrote in his 1926 statement, "It is high time to rid ourselves of the notion that leisure for workmen is either lost time or a class privilege." The 8-hour workday only became federal law in the United States in 1938, under Roosevelt's Fair Labor Standards Act, which capped the standard workweek at 44 hours. 44 hours, not 40, 44. As the legal maximum, pause on this, the 8-hour day, the thing we call normal, was what labor activists were dying for as a dream. It was so radical it took over a century of organized resistance, strikes, riots, and federal legislation to achieve. And now we use that 8 hours as a floor, as the baseline minimum we're expected to contribute before the laptop emails begin arriving, before the Slack messages that come in on Sunday, before the expectation that you're reachable and responsive outside the official window because that's just how it is now. We took the 19th century labor movement's greatest victory and made it the entry-level requirement. The prehistoric humans' 3 to 5 hour workday was not a limitation of capability. It was the natural output of a system calibrated to actual need. Get enough food, maintain social bonds, rest, sleep. And in the remaining time, which was most of the time, do the things that aren't work but that turned out to matter enormously. Tell stories, make music, raise children, maintain the social fabric, think, talk, rest. Because those things, it turns out, were not the reward for completing work. They were the work. The social bonding that happened around the fire at night was not leisure in the way we use the word. It was communal maintenance, it was cultural transmission, it was the mechanism by which knowledge and relationships and identity persisted across generations. Without it, the group falls apart. Without it, the knowledge dies. Without it, the children don't know who they are. The 3 to 5 hours of food work kept the body alive. The remaining hours kept the community alive. Both were necessary. Neither was optional. And the modern schedule treats the latter as though it barely exists. Is this making you rethink anything about how you structure your days? Drop your honest reaction below, not rhetorical. I genuinely want to know. Back to the Siegel-Ookla study. The prehistoric human goes to sleep roughly 3 hours and 20 minutes after sunset. Not at sunset. not immediately when it gets dark, 3 hours after. In that window, the fire is the only light source. The fire produces warm spectrum light, orange, red, that does not suppress melatonin the way blue spectrum light from screens does. This isn't a wellness claim, this is optics. The wavelengths matter. Fire is physically different from an LED screen. And what happens in those 3+ hours between sunset and sleep, the storytelling, the music, the conversation, the social processing of the day's events, happens in light that keeps the melatonin production going naturally rather than suppressing it artificially. The body is preparing for sleep, while the community is doing the night's social work. These two things are not in conflict. They reinforce each other. When the temperature drops enough, and this is the consistent finding across all 3 of Siegel's study populations, sleep begins. Not because someone decided it was bedtime, because the environment became cool. The body, tracking thermal signals through the skin and through the body temperature cycle that runs independently of light exposure, crosses a threshold and begins the transition to sleep. Approximately 6.5 hours later, as the temperature rises with the sun, the sleep period ends and the cycle begins again. No alarm, no schedule, no REM sleep interrupted at an arbitrary clock time. Just a body running on the rhythms it was calibrated to run on, across hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. And they woke up healthy. The Hadza, who have been the most intensively studied of these groups, showed in data compiled by Pontzer's team, no obesity epidemic, no hypertension epidemic, no type 2 diabetes epidemic, no reported population-level insomnia, cardiovascular fitness that embarrasses industrial populations of any age, the absence of every major chronic disease that is currently killing people in wealthy industrialized nations at scale. This is not romanticization. This is measurement. Pontzer spent years carefully measuring the metabolic, cardiovascular, and activity data of the Hadza, and published findings in journals including PLOS One and the American Journal of Human Biology. The Hadza live an extraordinarily physically demanding life. By modern standards, they walk 8 to 12 kilometers per day on foraging trips, and they do not develop heart disease. The combination of the schedule, the movement, the social structure, and the sleep pattern produces bodies that function well into old age, in ways that the modern schedule is not replicating. Let's put the actual prehistoric 24-hour schedule together, from everything we've covered, as a complete picture. Sunrise, approximately, temperature rising, no alarm. The body surfaces from roughly 6.5 hours of sleep, driven to its endpoint by thermal and light signals from the environment, not ripped from REM by an alarm 3 minutes before it would have naturally ended. Body temperature rising, consciousness returning gradually, some lying still, some quiet conversation, fire being maintained or restarted. This is not rushed. There is nowhere to be at a specific time. Late morning, the primary work of the day begins. For forager men, this might mean a hunting excursion of 3 to 6 hours covering 8 to 12 kilometers. For forager women, a foraging run covering 5 to 7 kilometers, including the work of identifying, digging, processing, and carrying plant foods. The children are present, learning by observation and participation. The social fabric of the group operates continuously during this time. People talk, cooperate, navigate, make decisions in real time about where to go and what to pursue based on what they observe. This is high cognitive engagement, high physical engagement, and high social engagement for 3 to 5 hours. Not 8, not 10, not 12. Early to mid-afternoon, the food is acquired. The physical work of the day is done. Camp activities continue at a lower intensity. Tool maintenance, social grooming, rest, children playing play that is also learning, informal knowledge transfer between adults, the fire, conversation, music in some communities. The afternoon is long and unhurried in a way that is genuinely difficult to imagine from within a schedule-based modern life. After sunset, 3+ hours of fire, storytelling, social processing, and community maintenance. The light is warm spectrum, the melatonin is rising, the temperature is falling. The body is preparing for sleep while the community does its cultural work. When the temperature crosses the threshold, sleep begins. 6.5 hours later, the cycle begins again. That is the real 24-hour schedule of prehistoric humans. Not the one with the heroic hunt that takes up the whole day. Not the one with constant survival threat. Not the one where every hour is filled with purposeful action. Just this. Work for a few hours. Eat. Be together for most of the rest. Sleep. Repeat. For hundreds of thousands of years. Building. In the process, every form of human culture, language, music, art, social structure, the accumulated knowledge that eventually produced all the things we call civilization, not in the margins around the work, in the center of the time, in the hours that were not filled with obligation. Here's what this data does not mean. It does not mean you should quit your job and go live in a cave. It does not mean agriculture was a mistake that should be undone. It does not mean that the complexity and abundance of modern life isn't real or valuable. It is. It obviously is. The lifespan gains from modern medicine alone are extraordinary. The access to knowledge, to experience, to human connection across distances that would have been impossible for any forager, these things matter. The comparison between prehistoric and modern life is not a competition between an obviously better past and an obviously worse present. What it does mean is this: the 8-hour workday was not derived from human biology. It was derived from labor activism against 16-hour industrial factory shifts. The natural amount of sleep is not 8 hours, it's 6.5, driven by temperature, not clocks. The transition from foraging to farming made individual humans work more, not less, and gave them worse outcomes across most physical health measures. The transition from farming to industry made things dramatically worse again. And the digital layer we've added on top of the industrial schedule, the emails at 2 a.m., the Sunday Slack messages, the expectation of constant availability, has extended the industrial workday into the hours that were, for most of human history, the hours that kept humans human. The storytelling hours, the music hours, the fire hours, the sleep hours. The prehistoric human had the schedule right, not because they were wiser or more spiritually enlightened or better adapted, because the schedule was calibrated by hundreds of thousands of years of actual biological feedback. The body was built by that schedule. The brain runs best on that schedule. And then in a period of about 10,000 years, less than 4% of the time humans have existed as a species, we rebuilt the schedule from scratch, based on economic systems that had never consulted the biology. And we have spent the time since defending the new schedule as normal and biological and natural, while the actual biological evidence points in a completely different direction. The alarm will go off tomorrow at whatever time the calendar says it needs to. The emails will be there, the meetings will be scheduled. None of that is changing from this video. But there is something useful in knowing that the version of a day that feels most natural, the one with enough sleep, a few hours of meaningful work, long, slow afternoons, and evenings spent in real conversation with people you care about, is not a fantasy or a privilege or a reflection of not working hard enough. It is the schedule human beings ran on for the vast majority of their existence, and every study that has tried to measure it has found that the people still living that schedule are healthier in every measurable dimension than the people who replaced it with hours. The 8-hour day was a revolution, the 3-hour day was evolution, and we went backwards. What one thing from the prehistoric schedule do you actually want back in your life? The sleep pattern, the work hours, the fireside evenings, the total absence of emails at 2 a.m.? Tell me specifically. I want to see the breakdown.